The Battle of Berlin was one of the last major offensives of the European theater of World War II, but what led to this final showdown? The Red Army had temporarily halted on a line 60 kilometers east of Berlin after the Vistula-Oder offensive of January-February 1945, setting the stage for a dramatic conclusion. As the Soviet forces regrouped, Germany established its defense plan for the city with Operation Clausewitz on March 9, but would it be enough to stop the impending onslaught? The first defensive preparations at the outskirts of Berlin were made on March 20, a desperate attempt to hold back the tide. As the Soviet forces prepared to strike, the German military was in disarray. The Soviet offensive resumed on April 16, and the Red Army encircled the city after successful battles of the Silo Heights and Helby. The First Belarusian Front led by Marshal Georgy Zhukov started shelling Berlin's city center on April 20, 1945, marking the beginning of the end. But what was the state of the German forces defending the city? The garrison consisted of several depleted and disorganized army and Waffen-SS divisions, along with poorly trained Volkssturm and Hitler Youth members, a far cry from the once mighty German army. As the battle raged on, the Soviet forces made steady gains. Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front broke through Army Group Center and advanced towards the southern suburbs of Berlin on April 20, 1945. General Helmuth Weidling assumed command of the forces within Berlin on April 23, but it was a losing battle. The Red Army gradually took the entire city over the course of the next week, and Hitler's life came to an end on April 30, marking the end of an era. But what was the final toll of the battle? The city's garrison surrendered on May 2, and fighting continued to the northwest, west, and southwest of the city until the end of the war in Europe on May 8. The Battle of Berlin was a culmination of a long and brutal campaign. The Red Army began the Vistula-Oder offensive across the narrow river and from Warsaw on January 12, 1945, marking the beginning of the end of Germany's Eastern Front. The Red Army broke out and started moving west, up to 30 to 40 kilometers per day, taking East Prussia, Danzig, and Poznan. But the German military was not ready to give up yet. The new army group Vistula conducted Operation Solstice, a counterattack, but this had failed by February 24, and the Red Army drove on to Pomerania, clearing the right bank of the Oder River, thereby reaching into Silesia. As the Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, the city was subjected to intense bombing campaigns. The United States Army Air Forces launched mass day raids on Berlin during 1945, and the Royal Air Force, RAF, Mosquitoes bombed the German capital for 36 nights in succession, ending on the night of 21 April 1945. But the Soviet forces had their own objectives. Stalin began the Soviet offensive on a broad front and moved rapidly to meet the Western Allies as far west as possible. The Soviet Union had two objectives: to capture Berlin and to meet the Western Allies as far west as possible, a delicate balancing act. The Battle of the Silo Heights was a pivotal moment in the campaign. The Battle of the Silo Heights was fought over 4 days from 16 until April 19, and almost 1 million Red Army soldiers and more than 20,000 tanks and artillery pieces were deployed to break through the gates to Berlin. The Soviet forces led by Zhukov broke through the defensive positions, having suffered significant losses, a heavy toll. But the German forces suffered even more, with substantial losses during the Battle of the Silo Heights, a devastating blow. As the Soviet forces advanced, the German military was in disarray. The First Ukrainian Front captured Forst on April 18, and the Soviet forces drove a wedge between Army Group Vistula in the north and Army Group Center in the south. The German Eastern Front line north of Frankfurt around Silo and to the south around Forst had ceased to exist by the end of April 19, a catastrophic collapse. The Soviet forces enveloped the German Ninth Army in a large pocket west of Frankfurt, a desperate situation for the German military. The Battle of Berlin was a complex and multifaceted campaign. The Soviet forces had two main objectives: to capture Berlin and to meet the Western Allies as far west as possible. The Soviet Union had a vast array of forces at its disposal, with 2.5 million men, 6,250 tanks, 7,500 aircraft, 41,600 artillery pieces and mortars, 3,255 truck-mounted Katyusha rocket launchers, and 95,383 motor vehicles, a formidable force. But the German military was not ready to give up yet, and the battle would rage on for several more days. As the battle drew to a close, the Soviet forces were poised for victory. The First Belarusian Front broke through the final line of the Selo Heights on April 19, and the Soviet forces drove on towards Berlin. The city was surrounded, and the German military was in disarray. The Soviet forces had suffered significant losses, but they had achieved their objective. The Battle of Berlin was a decisive victory for the Soviet Union, and it marked the end of the war in Europe. The aftermath of the battle was devastating. The city of Berlin was in ruins, and the German military was defeated. The Soviet forces had suffered significant losses, but they had achieved their objective. The Battle of Berlin was a decisive victory for the Soviet Union, and it marked the end of the war in Europe. As the Soviet forces occupied the city, they began to rebuild and restore order. The Battle of Berlin was a turning point in history, and it marked the beginning of a new era. The Battle of Berlin was a complex and multifaceted campaign, involving multiple armies and fronts. The Soviet forces had two main objectives: to capture Berlin and to meet the Western Allies as far west as possible. The Soviet Union had a vast array of forces at its disposal, and they were determined to achieve their objectives. The battle was fierce and intense, with both sides suffering heavy losses. But in the end, the Soviet forces emerged victorious, and the Battle of Berlin marked the end of the war in Europe. The Battle of Berlin was a significant turning point in history, marking the end of the war in Europe and the beginning of a new era. The Soviet forces had achieved their objectives, and the German military was defeated. The city of Berlin was in ruins, but the Soviet forces began to rebuild and restore order. The Battle of Berlin was a complex and multifaceted campaign, involving multiple armies and fronts. It was a decisive victory for the Soviet Union, and it marked the beginning of a new era in European history.